On the other side of toxic Christianity, I found myself faced with one question. Now what? This podcast is about that question. We have conversations with folks who are asking themselves the same things. We're picking up the pieces of a fractured and fragmented faith. We're finding treasure in what the church called trash, beauty and solidarity in people and places we were told to fear, reject, and dismiss. I'm Miche Spencer-Helms, and this is Life After Leavened. Back everyone to Life After Leavened. I'm your host, Miche Spencer-Helms, and I'm so elated to be joined by my friend Miche Van Essen. Miche, I'm going to have you introduce yourself, tell the people who you are, where you're from.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Miche. That's like quiche. Always like to say that. That way people will remember my name. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. Nice and close by. I am a management consultant, although lately I have been shifting my work towards church consulting more. And I'm a doctoral student as well. So I study leadership, specifically leadership in faith spaces. And I'm trying to figure out how we can bridge the gap between, pastors. It's not pastors' fault. That's specifically not what I'm saying. They go to an MDiv and they hope to be equipped with all the leadership skills, but MDivs focus mostly on spiritual, which is great, but we should also focus a little bit on practical things like change management or conflict resolution and HR principles.
Yes, absolutely. Just a little bit of things there that you need to focus on. So, I think you know the show, you know what we talk about,
Yes.
and you know that the concept of leaven that we're using is coming from the book where we're talking about white supremacy, homophobia, the waves of empire. That's what we mean by leaven. So, can you tell me a little bit about your journey out of a leavened faith?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of background. I live on the intersection of multiple identities, and it took me 40 years to get to a place where I'm fine. So I'm a trans woman, I'm an Indonesian woman, and I'm a Jewish woman, and I happen to confess Jesus as Messiah as well. That's a lot of identities, let's put it that way. However, in my past, because of many reasons, like say it's the culture that I grew up in, or the perpetuation of certain theologies on entire nations, because of that I've struggled and been physically hurting because of that. So let me start with my Asian identity, because I feel like that's something that is not talked about a lot. Ever since I was young, growing up. Well, when I was younger, I looked more Asian, but the moment that people stopped seeing an Asian person, they used to always say, "Well, you don't look Asian," and stuff like that. And it affected me more than I thought. Right? So it's a cultural perception of like, this is what an Asian person should look like. And in the case of where I grew up in the Netherlands, and also in America, because I still get that joke, haha, very funny. I still get that joke all the time. It's what people mean when they say you don't look Asian. They mean you don't look East Asian. They have no idea that Southeast Asia is still Asia, because it has the name Asia in Southeast Asia.
So technically it's Asian.
So, yes. Ugh. But on top of that, there's a lot of problems that are deeper rooted within that. So first of all, there's a perception of how I should look like as an Asian. And then my parents, or my mother specifically, she moved towards to the Netherlands from Indonesia in the 50s. And there was a lot of uncertainty. The Dutch left their colonized region, and they said, "Oh, these 17,000 islands are now one country. Welcome Indonesia to the world." And there was a lot of turmoil. So they moved to the Netherlands, but they didn't move to an Indonesian neighborhood. and they preferred not to talk about their Indonesian heritage besides food. Like yes, food.
Food, yes.
And to complicate it even more, my grandfather was born in Papua New Guinea, which is considered, if you study, what is that called in English? Geography, I guess,
Yes.
which is considered, or probably anthropology, is considered Melanesia. And when we say Melanesia, we're like, oh yeah, that's just a region in the Pacific Ocean. But we don't understand that a white person said, oh, Papua New Guineas, they're essentially black, and Indonesians are not as black, so we're gonna call them Melanesians. It's weird, but we still use the term, right? So there's a lot of identity that is just complicated right there. And growing up being told that I don't look Asian, having a family that doesn't identify as Asian, it took me years and years and years to get to the conclusion, wait a second, you have a super, super deep and rich culture and deep and rich heritage that has been stripped away from you by today's culture and in their perception of how I should look and behave, but also by the country that I was born in the Netherlands, that colonized Indonesia and stripped it from all its opportunity for its own gain. So there's some hefty colonization in my
Yes.
past, and it's just hard. That's why I wanted to start off with that topic, because we don't talk enough about Southeast Asian colonization. We don't talk about colonization enough in general, right?
Right. Right. Right.
Over
That part.
everything. Yeah. I mean, you and I talked about this before. The tin that's in our phones, in our laptops, is coming from the tin mines in Bangka, and people are being exploited there still today. Oof. So that is a big part of my identity that I'm trying to figure out. And that Leavened concept that you're saying is like, wow, I've been stripping myself of feeling of entering the richness of my culture because of what other people said, because of what a white culture has said to me, right?
Yeah, it's just been so interesting thinking about intersectionality and how we kind of come to the faith bringing all of who we are, but then having to do all this healing on multiple levels
Yes, exactly.
because of that leaven. For you, what was that process like? So you've mentioned you're a trans woman, so tell me a little
Yeah.
bit about which one of those things came first. Was it the ethnic identity that came first, or was it the gender identity?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because my ethnic identity was the latest to be awoken inside myself. One
Wow.
day
Okay.
I heard somebody tell me, "Is Barack Obama black?" I'm like, "Yes." Is he less black because he's half black? Like, no, he's black. You're Asian. Like, oh, okay, right. That's the last thing that
Wow.
came. That was the moment that I started thinking, wow, what have I done? But my trans identity was something that I was more familiar with because I was always leaning towards more, if you will, feminine things. I don't believe in a binary, but I'm just
Yeah.
using these terms to
Yes.
to express how most people would understand this. And so I wore girls' clothes when I was very young. I found a photo of myself the other day. I'm like, wow, yeah, that's me. I knew what's up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and every time I try to talk about it with either my parents or the faith community that my parents belong to, or with friends, it was always like, no, being wearing girls' clothes is gay, without even explaining that being gay is fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if that was what I was?
Right.
Or
Right.
my parents would say, no, that's being sinful because you're made in God's image, and you would be desecrating God's creation, etc., etc.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
never stopped. That still is going on today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those lies are still being repeated in my head when I have very dysphoric days. So I feel that my gender identity journey made it easier for me to accept my interfaith journey of being Jewish and being married to a Christian and having an interfaith household, being a Jesus confessing Jew or Jewish matic or however you want to call it, right? Oh, sorry.
It's all good. It's life.
It's life. It's life.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it's so because let me rephrase that, because I was able to live in an ambiguity about my gender identity growing up, constantly hearing no, that's sinful, but meanwhile my brain knowing no, that's not correct, and then going into transition and stopping transition and going into transition, stopping transition, and then 2 years ago, fully 2.5 years ago, fully coming out into what I am today. That entire journey, because it's been so long and it's been so on the front of my mind, helped me being fine within the ambiguity of no, even though I don't understand what scripture says about transgender people, even if I don't understand what pastors' beef is with trans people, I can be trans and be loved by God at
Yeah.
the same time. So that kind of paved the path for me to embrace my interfaith identity first and then my ethnic identity as well.
Wow. Wow. You're like one of the most interesting people I have ever met. I just love talking to you. And you've mentioned a word that I cannot wait to get on this topic. So we're just going to go ahead and jump into the topic of ambiguity. Because you and I
Ooh.
in our conversations have talked about how, there isn't really a queer like pedagogy. There's not queer
Mhm.
theology that feels systematic, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And so that the need for that and your interest in these topics is just fascinating. So tell me a little bit about what you've been discovering about the concept of ambiguity.
So ambiguity came to mind because having lived, let me rewind a little bit. I
Sure.
was in a psych ward for 18 months. Um, most of it was inpatient. So this was after I went to rehab. I decided, I think I was an addict because I had some problems that I need to face. So I admitted myself to a center for specialistic psychotherapy. It was a group home with 24 people who all had borderline personality disorder.
Wow.
And it
Okay.
was a brand new therapy method of putting everybody together so that we could witness each other's behavior and see, oh, that's how it looks like to other people.
Wow. Okay.
And it was very effective for me, for other
Yeah.
people not, because the success rate was not high. It's never high, but it was just not
Mm-hmm.
high there. Just worked
Mm-hmm.
very well for me. I saw other people's behavior. I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I do as well. That's very
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable to watch.
Mm-hmm.
um, there was a group session that I had, and I was dropped off in the middle of Amsterdam at the wrong bus station. And I was not familiar with the location that I was. And I'm like, oh my everything. I am so afraid right now. I'm panicking right now, but I'm also excited to be in Amsterdam. And my psychotherapist stopped me and he says, can you have ambiguous feelings? Can you be both excited of being in Amsterdam and can you be afraid at the same time? Those
Mm-hmm.
are two feelings that you can just leave in the middle. And then he took it further and he said, he talked about the concept of ambivalence, where you can have excitement and fear are seemingly contradicting
Mm-hmm.
um, emotions. But that all that to say, it was the first time that I was really confronted with the topic of ambiguity. So fast forward when we are talking about my gender identity, very, very quickly, it became clear to me that I can reject the binary and I can have a beard back in my days
Mm-hmm.
and still don't want people to call me a manly man when I was presenting to the world as a man.
Mm-hmm.
And it made sense in my brain. It just made sense. But because I had to
Mhm.
live in that ambiguity for such a long time, and then
Mhm.
add on to that the ambiguity and ambivalence of being Asian but perceived white,
Mhm.
and the ambiguity and ambivalence that I have with people yelling Jews killed Jesus on one side, and people full-fledged breaking down in tears and said, "Oh, you're the chosen people. I'm so happy to meet you." At the same time, right? All those
Yes.
things, living in so much ambiguity, I
Wow.
decided to go on a exploration in scripture and in
Mhm.
theology, and say, okay, what if everything can be approached with ambiguity? What if I would have a hermeneutics of ambiguity, and not just a hermeneutics of interpreting scripture, but also
Mhm.
an hermeneutics of interpreting my
The world.
worldview, right?
Yeah.
Everything.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's where that concept came from. For example, huh, um, I love the Bible,
Mhm.
and when I read Genesis chapter 1 and 2, I read a lot of things in it. I'm like, okay, on one hand, it could be two completely different stories. On the other hand, it could be two recallings of the same story. On the other hand, it could just be a made up story.
Yeah.
But I totally believe that God created the world.
Mhm.
Can I just be okay that I would never know the answer to what the
Exactly.
meaning of Genesis 1 and 2 is, and
Mhm.
still believe that God is the creator? Because
Yes.
is the story, what is the story trying to tell me? Is the story trying to tell me that heaven and earth was created in the 6th day, or is the story trying to tell me that God is the creator?
Yeah. Yeah.
If I take ambiguity as an approach,
Mhm.
the latter is my answer. If I take a literal black and white approach,
Mhm.
it needs to be
Mhm.
many things that I don't believe it's trying to be.
Yeah, it makes me think about kind of the message of Jesus when he talks about, well, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and
Ooh,
loving your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets, they hang on this. That
yes.
feels to me like a similar hermeneutic. It's basically, listen, this is what it boils down to. Okay,
Yeah,
here are the cliff notes for how to be a
right.
part of this thing that I'm building and forming. And it almost feels like Jesus had a similar hermeneutic with the world and with the Torah. Like, do you see that when you look at the gospels and the stories about Jesus at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that you bring up love the Lord with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Hmm.
Jesus was quoting a passage from Leviticus, and there's two parts to loving your neighbors as yourself. First, it states, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm the Lord, yada, yada, yada.
Hmm.
And then a little bit further, it says, you were once an alien in
Mm,
a country that was not your own.
yes.
Love the Lord as love your neighbor as yourself. I am the
Yes.
Lord. Those two passages belong together.
Yes.
So what has been said there is exactly contradictory to what I believe our immigration views are.
Yeah.
Like, boom, it's game over right there. The Bible doesn't say a lot of things clearly, but I think
Hmm.
progressive and conservative can all agree that love the Lord with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love the neighbor as yourself
Hmm.
is part of the core sentiments of
Hmm.
Christianity and
Yes.
even Judaism, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
if we can all agree on that part, and we see what is that based on, that
Hmm.
Abram was an alien in a land that was not his own.
Hmm.
He's not from Israel. He's from
That part.
Babylonia,
Hmm.
Mesopotamia, you know?
Hmm.
So all of that to say, if you look at contemporary issues with that feeling of like, okay, let's say I'm afraid. Miche is not, but let's say I'm afraid of immigrants because of the
Hmm.
rhetoric that's
Hmm.
coming around. Let's say I look at Sweden and I see that 1/8 of the population in Sweden is Muslim. And let's say because of the rhetoric, I've let it get to my head, and now I'm afraid, oh, the entire nation of Sweden is becoming Muslim. And
Hmm.
yes, there have been instances of anti Semitism directly related to immigration. That
Hmm.
is true.
Hmm.
But there is also a Jewish community that is happy and loving Sweden. That is
Yes.
also true.
Right.
And on top of that, it is our mandate to be hospitable. So
Yes.
can you be afraid of immigrants in that case, right?
Hmm.
And still be hospitable at the same time? I believe so. I think it is our
Yes.
mandate.
That is so beautiful, Mish, because it's what it does is it creates, even framing it that way is hospitable, right? Because you're saying, often we're given these binaries. You either have to be completely
Yes.
courageous or completely fearful, but what you're saying and drawing out is that you can be both, that we can
Yeah.
be unsure and even a little bit afraid and also hospitable, and that
Yes.
that is the call is not to do things perfectly. The call is not to do things like, we don't have to wait to catch up a lot of times. Just like the mandate is
Yes,
hospitality.
exactly.
And oftentimes I think that first step of saying, I don't understand all of this, I'm not familiar with all of this, but I'm going to take that first step of being hospitable, right? Of showing hospitality.
Yes.
And what happens is you begin to learn, right? And your love grows. Your love for
Mm.
people expands. Your understanding of God expands. Like, I believe worship grows because you're getting more images of God in your life, right? You have more
Exactly.
expressions of the divine walking around in these relationships that you took that one step. I don't get it. I might say the wrong thing, but I'm going to take that step and say, I'm going to open up to this. I'm going to be hospitable. And here we are. Like, and I feel like that's
Right?
something that, yeah, I feel like that's something that happened with me even before I knew I was queer. It
Yeah.
was like, I've heard nothing but the Bible taught, I've heard nothing but God is anti A, B, or C, right? And that the
Mhm.
Bible was clear about that. And it just wasn't squaring with my experience, right? Because
Mhm.
on the other hand, there was this ambiguity of like, but God says just love people, right?
Right.
And so I lean into the love part and I end up being like, wow, like the individuals that I have been connecting with and getting to know are incredibly godly,
Yes.
incredibly kind, exhibit the fruits of the spirit. What I was told about this community is not true about this community. And that was
Yeah.
before I even came out myself. And so I feel like the call of God to be hospitable is so brilliant because it's a
Mm.
curiosity. It's a saying, maybe God is here.
Yes.
Instead of assuming that God is not there. You know what I
Yes.
mean? So
Yes,
talk to
absolutely.
me about like, so this hermeneutic, what does it look like? In your daily life, does it show up in your daily life? This hermeneutic of ambiguity.
Yeah, it shows up towards me in
Mm-hmm.
how I expect to be approached,
Mm-hmm.
and it shows up in my view towards other people. So
Mm,
let me start with the first one. Towards me, I want to be accepted into the fold of people's homes.
mm,
Very, very uh, high level, if you will.
mm-hmm.
Say I go to hell because I'm trans.
Mm-hmm.
Your marketing is wrong. Yelling at me is not helping anyone.
Exactly.
I
Right.
don't know who you're trying to reach, but if I go to hell, maybe you should invite me to have a meal in your house and show me
Mm,
some hospitality, right?
mm-hmm.
You can be afraid of me. You can be afraid that I may influence your kids in a wrong quote, air quotes I do now,
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
a wrong way. Eh, But I'm asking you to also take that step of faith, that and live in the ambiguity of like, okay, Mish kind of intimidates me. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure what I think of trans people. I'm not sure about Mish's sexuality, and I'm kind of afraid to see what happens if Mish interacts with my kids.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still gonna invite Mish over for dinner.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I accept expecting people to approach me, which
Mm-hmm.
has been a huge deal right now because this is just okay. I give this to other people. I want to receive it as well. So to other
Mm-hmm.
people, so that's towards me. Towards others is, for example, progressives are doing the same as conservatives. So
Talk about it,
if
Mish.
right,
Talk
if
about it.
if you are a Donald Trump voter and say that is the worst offense in the world, Do you really think that yelling at that person and posting reels about how quote unquote ridiculous they are is going to win anybody over? It's
Right.
okay to be afraid of somebody that has ideals that align with Donald Trump. But I'm asking everybody to think, just live in that ambiguity and still invite them over for dinner. Yeah, but they don't respect my pronouns or they don't respect my identity. I just ask, I just ask this, and this is how I do it. I differentiate between the public realm and the private realm. This is an ancient idea. I did not come up with this. This is an old theological idea where we have the public realm in philosophy as well, for the record. Where we have a public realm is this is where I move. This realm belongs to everyone. That
Yes.
means that even though I have strong and even strong opinions, maybe I even believe legit opinions, this realm belongs to everybody and I need to share it with
Yes.
everybody, even with people I disagree with. So in the public realm, I better be showing some tolerance towards other people, even if it's borderline hurtful, because when I go home to my private realm, it is 100% safe.
Safe.
My family is safe. My friends are safe. I have zero tolerance in my private sphere for any dissenting opinions, if you will. Like obviously, if people say to me, Mish, that's a weird opinion to have as friends. Yeah, sure, it's safe enough to do that. But when it comes to uh, my identity as a woman, I don't have time for that in my private sphere.
Exactly.
I don't have time for that even in my church. If I go to church, that's not public sphere. That's my private place of worship. I need that to be safe. So when I'm talking about that public realm, there is a lot of space for ambiguity because I can always go back to my safe place and recharge a little bit and then wake up the next morning and say, okay, here comes another day. But I don't believe that the solution that we're doing right now, the polarization on both sides, is helping us get anywhere.
It's not, yeah. Yeah. It's like making enemies. And it's like how and I agree with you. And I think I kind of live in this space of people think I'm a little too soft and kind to people that are problematic or whatever. But to me, it just feels like, well, the call is to love your enemy. So
Mhm.
whether this person feels like an enemy to me or they think I'm their enemy, the call is to
Exactly.
love. And
Yeah.
so, like, that's what I've been asked to do. That's what I will give my attention and my energy to. And when I fail at that, I will admit that. And I feel like it's so interesting because it's like you enter into that kind of praxis. And on the
Yes.
one hand, it is very difficult and painful, which is why we need those safe spaces. But on the other hand, it's like this is the life Jesus talked about. This well on the inside, this fire that can't be quenched, this perpetual stream of living water flowing even in the midst of the chaos and dealing with problematic people. And it's so
Yeah.
interesting to me that, like, there is even an amount of hospitality involved in that process, even being hospitable to myself as I learn to navigate enemies and loving enemies and creating safe spaces. And it just creates this very beautiful, robust way of doing life in God. And I
Yes.
see that a lot in the Jewish frame, right? The
Yeah.
Tikkun Olam and all of those things. Can you
Yes.
talk a little about Tikkun Olam? I love
Oh,
this concept.
absolutely. Tikkun Olam is a universal Jewish concept, but it's more practiced by Reform and conservative Jews. When I say conservative Jews, they're conservative compared to Reform Jews, just to make everything complicated. They're very liberal.
Yes.
Whatever, different topic. Anyway, the legend goes that God placed uh, the light of God into a big vase. And one day, humanity tried to take control of that vase. And in that in that kerfuffle, if you will, of everybody pulling, the vase broke, and because there was so much energy in that vase, the vase shattered into millions and billions of pieces all across the world. So the concept of Tikkun Olam is to repair that vase. So if you grab one piece of the vase and you bring it back to the source, cosmically speaking, you have brought the world one step closer to the repair of the world. So Tikkun Olam essentially means the repairing of the world. And it's a concept that I am very passionate about because of that uh, hopelessness that we sometimes feel. It's like, oh, I just talked to my aunt, and she says, okay, I think I'm gonna be more nice to gay people, but there's her entire church that hates people. What does it even matter? No. Tikkun Olam.
Yes. Come on, Miche.
Every shard is one step, cosmically speaking, closer to bringing us together as one big family of God, and it's beautiful. Yeah.
It reminds me, because obviously my context, I'm going the other way, right? As a Gentile, encountering Jesus and then being real interested in Jesus's background in history and
Yeah.
so falling in love with these concepts and this idea of like a cup of cold water in my name.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
that to me is Tikkun Olam. Like,
Yes.
and this idea too of like, when you think about the smallness of like, well, I'm being kind to the queer community, my church is problematic, and the fact that even your kindness is a part of repairing the world
Mhm.
is so interesting, because you think about Jesus's ministry and it was really unimpressive in some ways, right? Like he didn't have, like, he wasn't packing out stadiums, like
That's
people
right.
went home after, like he had 12
Uh-huh.
that hung with him for about 3 years, which is a typical time frame for most ministry
Yeah.
involvement. And then they dip, like they all
Yeah.
leave
Yeah.
at the very
Bye-bye.
end when the going gets tough. Like they all leave, right? And so when
Yeah.
if we had anybody, that person would not be an influencer. They would not be asked to speak at nobody's conference. We would look at that and say they don't have enough of a following. They don't have enough of a platform. And to
Right.
me, Jesus is embodying that. Like, it doesn't need to be big. It doesn't need to be flashy. It needs to be authentic, and it
Yes.
needs to be integral, right? When you think about these things, and as we kind of, I want you to talk a little bit about what you're thinking about writing, if you
Uh-huh.
want to.
Sure
When you think
thing.
about that, like, how does that play into kind of what you're thinking about putting out into the world soon?
So I have been working on a concept for a book um, for the last couple of months. Partly because I want more speaking engagements, very practically, and I thought, what will get me more speaking engagement if I write on the topics that I speak of.
Mhm.
So there is a concept that I've been wrestling to explain, but lately it's been made more sense also within the concept of ambiguity,
Mm.
and it just states, for example, let me get very practical.
Yeah.
For example, um, say you believe that science says that there's biologically only male and female. Let's leave the intersex community out. Doesn't matter, right?
Hmm.
Say that that's what you believe, and
Hmm.
say I believe, no, science actually says that there's difference between sex and gender is a social construct, and yes,
Hmm.
within sex I may agree with you, what gender wise I disagree with you.
Hmm.
So we can agree or disagree on that.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't
Hmm.
matter. What does matter is that we need to have conversation with each other. But the
Hmm.
problem with today's world, the reason why we are dipping more and more into polarization, is that we're falling for those traps,
Yeah.
right? The
Hmm.
moment somebody comes to me and says, Mish, the Bible is clear, homosexuality is a sin. And I say, well, homosexuality is an anachronism. It can't actually be about homosexuality in the Bible. It's probably talking about active and passive same-sex action, but it cannot possibly be about homosexuality. If I say that as a response, I've fallen for the trap. That person is not trying to set a trap. I think if you think about demonic activity, I think that's
Yes.
like, I'm
Yeah.
Satan, let me plan out the destruction of the world. That's how I do it. By
Wow.
polarizing people,
Wow.
by making a bigger tower of Babel that is actually damaging, right? What happened around there. But what I'm trying to say with the trap is, it is a trap, because if somebody comes to me and says, Miche, I believe that the Bible condemns homosexuality, and but I don't believe in inerrancy,
Right.
and my starting point is completely different. And
Yes.
even if the Bible would clearly state that it was against homosexuality, it's also against touching a woman who had her period and anything she sits on, and anything the person if a person touches the bed of somebody who just had a period, that person becomes unclean, etc., etc. Or the Bible also state that eating fish without scales and fin is an abomination. However, Scripture translates it as not an abomination. It translates it as detestable, which is again another story. The agendas in Scripture. But what I'm trying to say here, to bring it back, we need to address that we have different starting points. And
Yeah.
we need to understand that we cannot have a discussion if we don't have the same starting point. We just need to,
Yes.
just like if a Muslim would come to a Buddhist and they start arguing why their faith is right, they have a different starting point.
Right.
So that conversation is a non-starter. They
Right.
can talk about the weather, they can talk about McDonald's, they can talk about their joint passion for social
Yes.
justice. And that's what I'm
Yes.
trying to get at. Can we just
Yes.
leave those topics? I don't need people to accept that my identity is scientifically correct. I
Right.
don't I actually don't care. What I do care about is that I know that there's millions and millions of conservative Christians in America that are passionate about social justice. So can we talk about that instead of my gender identity, or can we talk about that instead of the atrocities that Trump supporters are
Yes.
committing? So
Right.
that's the concept of the book, if that makes sense.
I just love that, because it is like, again, it is bringing people from the margins to the center, but centering everyone, right? I
Yes.
like that idea, because what it does is it gives dignity, like we talked about with our ethnic identities, right? Like, me as a queer, non binary Black woman, my starting point is very different than a cishet, middle class, white pastor.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so what I felt like was happening in evangelicalism was people were forcing us into the same starting point, right?
Yeah.
That hegemony, right? Like, or hegemony, however you say it, of Babel, right? Like, let's all speak the same language, let's stay in one place. But no, actually what we needed was people who bring gifts to the Lord from every tribe, right? And
Yes.
bring perspective on this beautiful God that we might even not have the same words to describe the beauty, right?
Yeah.
But it's beautiful nonetheless. And it makes me think, we just passed Pentecost. It makes me think about that. They're declaring the wonders of God in their own tongue. You know,
Oof.
to me,
Exactly.
that's where it goes. It's this very beautiful picture, like, of when you see Babel kind of happening in the beginning, and then you see Acts happening, where it's kind of like, no, this is what it was meant to be. We go out and we each bring our gifts back to the
Yes.
Lord, and like, we all declare the beauty of God in our own tongue. And that, what that does, it feels to me like a buffet or a feast, right? Like,
Yes.
or like a big potluck, of people bringing the dishes that make sense to them, that have story and place behind them, and we feast together. And to me, it's kind of like, who I can't imagine not wanting to enter into that.
Yes.
And it's unfortunate, because I do think that folks will choose not to enter into that. But I love that what you're saying and what you're getting ready, I'm so excited to put out into the world is going to really kind of nail that down. Like, hey, this is a potluck. You don't come
Yeah.
to a potluck wondering why everybody didn't bring mac and cheese,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Like that's not
exactly.
what you do at a potluck. I
Yeah.
love that idea. As we bring it down, because I think there's some concepts here that folks might be maybe not as familiar with. I want you to kind of like bring it home again, like in two sentences. Talk to me about what it looks like for us to live in the world with a hermeneutic of ambiguity, and then I'll do my final three questions.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So first of all, because queer people have lived in this ambiguity so much, I believe that queer people have a lot to offer to the Christian
Yes.
community today. I'm not
Yes.
saying become queer, but I'm saying you can use a queer theology, if you
Mhm.
will, in order to start expecting more than just mac and cheese on the buffet.
Come
So
on.
that would be kind of like stripping
Yes.
it down to the bare bones.
Beautiful. Whew, I love talking to you so much, sis. Okay.
Same.
Okay, so final three questions. What are you bringing from the rubble, right? So, we talk about this kind of this life after leaven. What was worth keeping for you that you've brought into this new phase of following God? So that's question number one. Number
Mhm.
two, what are you binging? So are you reading something, watching something, listening to eating something? What are you binging? And then what are some words to live by? So in any order, whenever you're ready, you go ahead.
Whew, what am I bringing is a big question, and I like how you said it. What am I loving? Because there's this process of my voice. I'm in the midst of vocal coaching, so
Mm-hmm.
normally my voice sounds like this, and
Mm-hmm.
I've been able to bring it up a little bit, but my
Mm-hmm.
target voice is even higher pitched, more
Mm-hmm.
breathy, and more feminine.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a long journey. It's going to take me years to get to a place where I'm happy. However, I love singing. I love
Oh,
singing. So I can't just give that up. This Sunday
yes.
I'm going to DC and I'm on the worship team and I'm going to sing a song that is even from my past that I used
Mm,
to sing as a male worship leader.
mm,
I'm going to keep that stuff. I'm going to say goodbye to my voice over time. I know that's going to happen.
mm,
But when it comes to singing, yeah,
mm,
I it's one of my main communication methods with God, and I can't
mm,
just let that go. So maybe I'll be singing with a male voice a little bit longer. That's what I'm
mm.
bringing with me from
I
the
love
rubble.
that.
Again, being ambiguous. Oh, I'm comfortable with my voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, okay, let's still worship God with that voice.
Yes. Whew. That's so beautiful. Wow, that hit me on a level. What are you
Yes.
binging?
I
Anything you're
am
watching, listening to?
binging Vinland Saga, which is anime.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a cartoon based on like the wars surrounding King Canute's. And
Mm,
season one was very gory and lots of war, but it had like this deeper philosophical trope into it.
mm.
And season two almost has no war to it. And it's
Wow.
all
Okay.
about pacifism and how to be a pacifist and how to embrace pacifism. And I love it because it's such a central question
Mm-hmm.
that I like people to think about. Like in general, I love to ask the question to people, are you a pacifist? It's
Mm-hmm.
just a question, right? I'm not fishing for
Mm-hmm.
yes or no. I'm just asking, have you ever thought about before you give your opinion on Ukraine, before you give your opinion
Mm,
on Sudan, before you give your opinion on Yemen? Have you ever thought about
mm.
if you're a pacifist or not? And this show really wrestles with that question, but it's
Wow.
a cartoon. It's amazing.
Wow. Wow.
Very,
Wow.
very deep.
Ellison is a pacifist, so they're probably going to listen to this and start watching that, which means I'm going to probably
Ooh,
start watching that.
yes. Yeah. Well, season
Yeah.
one is not pacifism at all. It's full out war and flying arms and swords and yes, very gory. I'm like, what am I watching? Yeah.
Wow, give us some words to live by, Miche.
The words to live by is my big discovery from right now. When it comes to, and I'm specifically talking to people right now that are wondering, am I doing enough? And the answer is yes. Yes, you're doing enough. And the reason why is, for example, I am a consultant to churches and I focus on leadership principles. So we can really give extra training to pastors and church leaders so that they can be better prepared for the world to come. Right? That's my job. So if there is some sort of atrocity going out there, like Target's taking away their stock, sometimes I get asked, why are you not posting about that? What I'm doing is enough. I don't have to be the person that posts and talks and have an opinion about everything, especially if you're part of a marginalized community, right? There's some cishet white men that can do that for us.
Exactly.
if
And
you,
they do.
exactly. If you've found one thing that you want to focus on, Tikkun Olam, it's the one shard that you are bringing back to the core.
Whew, I love you so much, sis. I'm
I
so
love you
glad we're in the same city.
too.
And thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people find you?
On socials at Miche Van Essen, that's MicheVanessen. You can also find my consulting agency, which is called The Resonance, on
Mm.
jointheresonance.com. And I have a podcast as well. And Tuesday, June, what is that, 5th or 6th? Tamisa's episode is coming out. So go listen
Hey,
to that. The podcast is
cool.
called The Models We Live By.
Hey, thank you so much. And I'm sure people are going to start following you. I
Yay.
cannot recommend enough because the way that you teach us with such poise and grace on your socials,
Mm.
I think people really need to be following you and learning from you. And I cannot wait for you to write. I'm like so excited.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sis.
Thank you for listening. To put your money in your heart is donate to Subquatcher Inc. and clear the path for Black students today.